In this short tutorial, I will explain how to create pod in Kubernetes using the Python. The prerequisites is existing Kubernetes cluster. It may be KS cluster or other cluster. In my case, it's a kind cluster. So first thing we will do, we will create service account and then we will attach secret to this service account. Basically, it will be JWT token we using in order to communicate with the Kubernetes API using the Python. Then I will do a brief overview of the Python script. I will show you how can you get all the pods in the cluster using the Python. Then we will talk and I will show you how can you create the pod using the Python and eventually deleting the pod using the Python. So let's do it. Okay, so like I already explained, the prerequisites, it's to have existing Kubernetes cluster. It may be EKS or other Kubernetes cluster, doesn't really matter. In my case, it's kind cluster. I will overview briefly the kind in a couple of words. Basically, to find it, all the docs related to kind cluster or how to spin up this cluster, how to install this cluster, you can find in this doc. So it's very easy. You need to run this command to spin up the cluster, kind create cluster. And for the installation, you need to go to this user guide. And as you see, it's also very easy to install on the Mac. You just need to execute brew install kind. To run it on the Linux, to install on the Linux, you need to apply those commands. That's basically it. So let's spin up the cluster. It will take a couple of seconds. I think it's very fast, 10-15 seconds, and that will be over. The cluster, the kernels of the cluster, it's basically based on Docker. I can show you even. As you see, kind control plane. So this is the kernels actually the Docker containers. Kind control plane, as you see. Okay, so let's not waste time on the kind. You can read the documents on the site of the kind, like I showed you previously. So the next step will be actually let's get the info about the cluster first. So this one is very important. It's basically the API endpoint of the Kubernetes cluster. We will need it in the Python script. Okay, so let's first create the service account. To create the service account, you actually need to run this command. Great Python API SA service account created. The next step will be to attach secret to the created service account, and you can see in this annotation we actually attaching the secret to needed service account. Python API SA, basically you need to define this annotation to attach to needed service account the secret. So let's first create this file, this YAML manifest with the secret. Great. So let's apply the secret itself. Great, so we now can see the secrets actually created. And why actually we need the secret and the service account? Because in order to communicate with Kubernetes from Python, you can use two options. One of them is the bearer token, and the bearer token is basically the JWT token, the secret we created, which have enough permissions to do with what we need, like creating, deleting the pods. The second option is to use kubeconfig. It's also possible using the Python with the Kubernetes library. I will show you in a minute. So let's give the needed permissions to the service account to make it possible to create pods and to delete pods. Basically, I'm giving the cluster role, which called cluster admin. I'm doing this in order to simplify this guide, but in production use case you don't want to use it because it's too much power, of course. Great, so now let's get the token from the secret we created. And as you see, the secret, let me show you. So the secret have the token, yeah, this one. So this is basically the JWT token we need in order to communicate with Kubernetes, but it's encrypted, base 64 encoded, sorry. So in token, in export token variable we use it in the Python, we need first to decode it. But let's just run this line, which exports the token into the token variable. You can see the token variable actually exported successfully. Great. Now the same thing we will do with the API server. Let's check. API server. Great, so this is the endpoint of the Kubernetes cluster in kind. Okay, so everything looks good, and the next step actually will be to create the needed Python script, which will talk to Kubernetes cluster and will create the pod. Basically, it will be a couple of methods I will add into the script. So let's do the overview. And another important thing I want to say, it's all the links you see inside of this doc I'm showing you now. So basically the reference will be attached to the YouTube video, so you don't need to worry about this. You will have all the references you see right now. The pod handler py, basically the script which I created for this demo. So let's do the brief overview of the script. Very simple. I'm using the Kubernetes library in Python to work with the Kubernetes. I need two variables I'm getting from the environment. Basically those are variables we exported, token and the API server. I need this to communicate with Kubernetes, like I already explained. The init client method, it's initialization of the client. This is the part of the Kubernetes library. The endpoint, it's a API server, verifies itself else in order to simplify the communication with the Kubernetes cluster. And this is the most important API key, because like I said, we using the token to communicate with the Kubernetes. In this example, you need to send in every request is as part of your header the bearer token, and the bearer token, it's the token we exported, right? JWT token we created and attached to service account I showed you a couple of minutes before. So we need client, basically the method which will initialize the method to work with the Kubernetes library. This one is commented. This is for you to understand. We have another option to communicate with Kubernetes is using the kubeconfig and config load kubeconfig. Basically, this line will get all needed credentials from the kubeconfig to communicate with Kubernetes cluster. So basically, we can you can comment this one and uncomment this one. In this case, you will work with kubeconfig directly and not with the bearer token. But I'm trying to demonstrate the JWT token usage we created previously. So the list pods, basically the method which will list all the pods using the API and the Kubernetes library. The create pod, basically method that will create busybox pod on the Kubernetes through this library. You can see just a simple manifest which uses the busybox image. And we create in this pod and in the default namespace. And eventually we'll delete the pod. To do it, you need to use delete namespace pod method, and you of course need to define the namespace and the name of the pod you're deleting, busybox in our case. And the main method basically will parse the arguments you're using. You can use list, create, and delete options through your arguments. List will get all the pods. To create pod, you need to run create, and delete you running for you will use to delete the pod you created. So let's do it. Let's go. So this is the pod handler, but just a second, I will show you. I explain how to run this script. So to list pods, you need to run pip install Kubernetes in order to install the Kubernetes library we use it in this script. And the next step will be to list all the pods. Great, it's working. We can confirm it with the kubectl, the same pods basically. So yes, it's working. Great. The next step will be actually to create the busybox pod. In order to do it, you need to run this line. You need to to run pod handler with the create option. Sorry, need to run py. And nice, and as you see, the busy box is created. 5 seconds. And I need to fix my documentation. I will do it. Great. And the last step, it's basically to delete the busy box pod we created. So let's do it. Terminate. Great. So everything is working. You can overview the script by yourself. It's very simple, and you can change it and play with it as much as you like. As and Like I already said, you can use two authentication methods. The first one with the bearer token, and the second one with the kubeconfig if you want. I think basically that's it. Thank you. Thank you for watching.